Episode 5.5, Listener Questions.
You're listening to Guns Guide to Liberals, the podcast where we explore ideas and techniques that help you break down partisan barriers, build rapport across the aisle, and make a more persuasive case for the Second Amendment. I'm John Houtman.
And I'm Sarah Cade. In this episode, we'll talk a little bit about why you shouldn't share this podcast with your liberal friends, and we'll answer some listener questions. We're also live streaming this episode right now on our Facebook page.
Hello, Facebook page.
But first, John, are you ready for the holidays?
What do you mean by ready?
It's a trick question.
I suppose so. Christmas still feels like it's 15 days away, even though it's a handful of days away at this point. I'm glad I don't have to do a lot of traveling this year, and that's about that. I'm never ready for it.
Yeah, me either. I'm one of those people that's always doing like last minute shopping, and I deeply regret it every year, and I never learn from it, and I continue to repeat the same mistakes.
Hence why we're doing listener questions.
Right.
Because it's super easy and requires less content preparation.
This is correct. Yeah, we usually spend, depending on the episode, maybe 10 to 20 hours of research and writing before each episode. So it's really like a part-time job.
Yeah, and this one, while we spare no expense for our listeners, we are doing the time-expedient process this week.
Correct.
So thank you for your questions, and thank you for contributing to the podcast.
Yes, that's awesome of you. The first question, it's really not so much a question as an observation or a caution, but should you share this podcast with your liberal friends?
We will answer that question with a question. What happens when you share information that threatens a person's worldview without taking any steps to reduce defensive bias?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about defensive bias, so you have probably a pretty good idea of how it's going to turn out already. It will most likely cause a backfire effect that will most likely make that person more firmly anti-gun than they were before. And one thing to keep in mind is just because this show doesn't activate your defensive bias doesn't mean it won't activate their defensive bias. It's a really individual thing. And, these are your friends, you know them best, and you can make your own determinations on what's best to do.
In general, this podcast is not designed to reduce defensive bias in a liberal-leaning listener. We made this podcast for pro-gun people to make progress in the culture war by talking about guns better with their friends and family. A lot of what we talk about here is persuasion techniques and a certain amount of inside baseball that requires some prerequisite understanding or familiarity with the kinds of arguments and philosophy that are common in the pro-gun field.
Right. Yeah, this is, if you think of it kind of as an instructor level course, we presume a pretty high body of knowledge. We don't go to a lot of trouble to explain or reduce bias in people on the other side.
Yeah, this isn't something that you can hand to someone in order to change their mind. This isn't going to do that work for you. We don't have a relationship with those people that allows us to help them through their various defensive biases. You do. You're the one who's building trust and having good faith conversations. We're just trying to empower you to do that as effectively as possible. This isn't like the red pill that you can, force down their throat.
Right. Yeah. And, you can share this with your liberal friends if you want, but just kind of keep in mind it's not really designed for their typical or traditional type of defensive bias. So if you've been listening since the beginning, you've kind of got the tools to evaluate that for yourself, and you've got the tools to decide whether or not that's a good idea for your friends that you know their values, and you can make that determination.
Yeah, this is Guns Guide to Liberals, not for liberals. It's not a shortcut to doing the work yourself, and there's nothing you can simply share with anybody that will just immediately change their mind.
Yeah, that just doesn't exist at all. I'm not aware of anything really ever that somebody has clicked on and consumed that has immediately changed their mind. In all of the success stories I know, that has been more of a gradual change that's been a result of a lot of relationship building, a lot of trust building, and a lot of general strategies to reduce defensive bias. I don't think there's really anything that you could just click on, to change somebody's mind. It just doesn't really work like that.
Yeah, and in any circumstance where someone feels like they've had or observed a really rapid change, that's likely the result of there being either a lot of groundwork that went into it feeling like a sudden change. It's sort of like there's no overnight success. Mm-hmm. Like you see the overnight success, but you didn't see the 10 years of labor that got there. Or you could be dealing with someone who's so pliable that a rapid change isn't a durable change, and they could flit back and forth between a number of opinions too.
Yeah, that could happen. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think in general, if you want lasting change, the way to do that is to just kind of encourage somebody to explore information for themselves and come to their own conclusion. Because you can trick or manipulate somebody into thinking that they changed their mind on an issue, but it's not an actual real change. And when they take the time to examine it for themselves, they might come to a totally different conclusion. And then on top of now rejecting the conclusion you manipulated them into, they also have a lot of bad faith built up with you for doing that in the first place.
Right. Now they're extra suspicious.
Right. Yeah. So in general, you've got the tools, you've got the skills, so make your best decisions. The listener questions, I wish we had more time to get into all of them, but we're long-winded enough that we're only going to be able to get to a few.
We had a lot of great questions for
really
listener
good
questions. Some of them are a little outside the scope of what we're prepared to discuss on the podcast, and other ones are like you could write a book about them. Mm-hmm. So we picked, I think, 3 really solid listener questions that we got from the thread where we asked for questions, or were inspired by that, or have been asked to us in other contexts.
Right. And the ones we don't get to here, we might try to address later, maybe in a different live stream, or maybe in, say if we have an episode that's running a little short and we need a little bit more time, we might try to get to some of those other questions there, because there were a lot of really good and insightful questions there.
We have a reserve of listener questions right. to deploy whenever necessary.
Yeah. So thank you for sending those in, guys. All right, so question 1. Why are we against the CDC studying gun violence? So the context on this is that back in the day, and I'm not going to quote a year on this because I will probably get it wrong, there was this thing called the Dickey Amendment that it actually didn't ban research into guns. What it did was prevent...
A common misconception.
Right, yep. But what it actually did was prevent the CDC from using taxpayer money to advocate for gun control. So it's not exactly a ban, but some will say that it had a chilling effect on gun research. And I guess my response to that is that in order for that to be a chilling effect on gun research, the research must have been inherently partisan to begin with.
Right. Like why would we want taxpayer dollars to fund research that would come to conclusions that suppress the First Amendment?
Right. Yeah, there's a couple of issues there. And I think to answer the question, why are we against it? It's not that we're necessarily against it, but there are reservations. So I guess we'll answer it with a question again. What would you say if the CDC received $25 million of taxpayer money to study black-on-black crime? I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, that would raise some huge alarm bells because black-on-black crime is not a real thing.
It's a framing device.
It is, yeah. The vast majority of crime is intraracial rather than interracial. So within racial groups rather than outside of racial groups, which means to me that anyone that is using such an unscientific premise to frame the problem probably has an agenda and should be viewed with skepticism.
Right. Like most violence occurs between people who already know each other as a result of people who already know each other are available to each other. Mm-hmm. And reframing it in terms of that being a racial phenomenon is indicative of a racial motivation. So like, for example, I'm not opposed to the CDC studying whatever they believe to be in their purview. But for example, the CDC studies, quote, intimate partner violence. If they instead set out to study wife beating as a phenomenon, they'd arrive at a different set of data with some inevitably different conclusions, right? There's a difference between studying intimate partner violence, which describes a much broader spectrum of interactions and relationships than wife beating. The way you frame the problem is a limitation from the get-go. And when you approach it in terms of gun violence, black-on-black crime, or wife beating, you bundle a lot of conclusions into your hypothesis up front. And that's the kind of scientific approach which should be raising eyebrows for pretty much anyone. Like, depression and suicide may be a public health issue, but it's entirely plausible that violence is a sociological or even economic issue. And studying gun violence is too narrow of a scope, which bundles in certain assumptions, which can make it inherently political. If they have a mandate to study something, they should neutrally study violent crime and suicide as separate topics instead of approaching the issue with all the preconceptions that come from assuming that gun violence is a unique and non-arbitrary category of violence unto itself.
Right, exactly. That's the problem I have with it, is that the talking point generally on our side is that guns don't kill people, people kill people, which is, I hate that talking point because it's so simplistic and it's not persuasive even a little bit. However, the grain of truth in it is that guns are a force multiplier. So they magnify the intent of the user. And so to say that, you're going to study gun violence as a separate category unto itself ignores all of the root causes of violence just to focus on the tool. And to me, I don't see that as a particularly useful thing.
I don't think that kind of framing is scientific enough that we should be paying for it.
Right. Yeah, and that's not to say that we're against research into guns and the impact of guns on society. That's kind of a different topic. But the problem, I'm going to backtrack a little bit here and relate this to another pet peeve of mine. The problem here is that in the past, the way that science has been used as kind of like a political cudgel, for example, by the blue team, my own team, to argue, for climate change, for example. That is a perfect example of how politicizing science harms everybody in this debate. So by using science to advocate for particular political policies without any impact or without any attention paid to the values and the impacts of those policies, that's a sure way to induce all kinds of defensive bias in the people that are receiving the science. So it almost like guarantees that your science isn't going to actually inform the debate. It's going to do the opposite.
Right. It's hard enough to get facts to matter to people who have a different set of values. And when those facts come pre-packaged in a political or politicized delivery system, you're making it doubly difficult to transfer those facts to people.
Right. And there is a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, but there's a fair amount of science on guns that is politically neutral and that does avoid a lot of that bias. And for example, we'll link in the show notes later. There's a RAND study on guns in the society, which does a really excellent job of staying policy neutral and using neutral language. It frames it as like, here are some facts that we can agree on. We're not advocating for or against any particular policies. And I think that's the way to go about it. Unfortunately, and this is why the CDC originally got in trouble, what they started doing instead was framing it in a way of like, well, the science shows that this is the case, therefore we must implement these policies because that's the rational thing to do. But that doesn't factor in any of the values questions around the gun debate. You can't really use science to answer values questions. And science can inform your policy decisions, but it can't make values judgments. And this is why we keep saying the gun argument is a values argument.
Right. Like what would happen if the CDC decided to study privacy as a public health issue and decided that we could reduce crime by eliminating the Fourth Amendment?
Yeah, there's, it's science. Sure, it's science, but that doesn't, it doesn't encompass the intangible values in society as well. So I think that's where it kind of falls flat. And, if a study came out tomorrow that said carrying a gun made you 60% less likely to be raped and murdered, your anti-gun friends are still not going to go out and buy one. And if the study said the opposite, you're not going to turn your guns in. So it just kind of goes to show there are a lot of deeper issues at play, and rational analysis is kind of an illusion for everybody in this debate.
At least when it comes to changing minds.
Yeah, and again, we're not saying there's no truth. There's no fact or there's no truth. We're just saying that when it comes to making decisions, humans make emotional decisions and then justify them after the fact. That's just kind of how we work. Okay, so our second listener question. What do you imagine, if anything, could be done to improve the way the majority of mass media represents the topics of gun violence and gun legislation?
So I think this is a kind of a ultimately pretty complicated question. So I'm going to dodge it just a little bit and frame this in terms of it not being a problem specific to violence. However, I think the media is captured by a number of counterproductive and toxic incentives. There's a lot of competition for eyeballs and attention, combined with how the media harvests dollars from various sources, either through, television views or website clicks or what have you. And the news is in competition with clickbait and binge watching for your attention, for your viewership. So sensationalization, commanding attention through the news cycle, and the compulsion to craft as compelling a narrative as something like Game of Thrones out of a hodgepodge of current events kind of ruins the news media. So you've got recurring themes and characters over long spans of time. It's not, people say, people just don't have the attention span they used to have. Yeah, they do. People have such a long attention span that they'll sit down and watch 2 seasons of a TV show in one day.
I've never done that.
No, never. Why would we, right? So people have long attention spans, and they have long attention spans for, things involving narratives and characters and interpretations of the world. And the news has to compete with that. So they've, every event fits into this somehow because it has to, because that's how they get your attention. So I think that changing how they represent current events and issues is going to require a radical reformation of the news incentive structure.
Yeah, and I don't have a very good answer for that either, except for I'm personally opting out of a lot of the sensation-driven outlets and sensation-driven formats. I'm just trying to be more mindful of what I consume, and I'm trying to share those values with the people close to me. It's easier said than done because that stuff is pretty seductive. Like, who doesn't want to learn that one weird trick?
Right.
Right. But, I don't think there's an easy answer for this. I don't think there's a legislative solution. I think really a market solution is probably the least intrusive onto our essential liberties. But it's also the hardest to implement because of just that market for sensationalism. It's like there's no shadow cabal behind the news that's shaping this narrative. They're just feeding us what we want to eat.
Yeah, it's going to take a personal moral revelation at the individual level for everyone who's consuming information and media to make a decision about what they will and won't consume. It's like we can't require that everyone makes healthy food. People just need to make better food choices if we're going to control obesity. And I think that we're in the phase of things where, the same way that industrial farming came along and almost, in terms of human history, overnight gave people just an immense and endless calorie surplus. And we've kind of realized the degree to which that's kind of killing people. We're currently in the information revolution period of everybody getting fat and sick and wondering why. And people are going to have to figure out whatever, constitutes informational nutrition and cognitive exercise in order to round the bend on this issue.
Yeah, there's no easy answer for that, at least nothing that I can see. Now, that said, I have had some friends who have had really good success at building relationships with reporters from local level to national level. And they've seen that directly reflected back in better quality reporting. And we've seen a little bit of that locally here as well. What that requires is a willingness to reach out to reporters, to invest your time, to building relationships, to risk rejection, which you'll get a lot of, and, be resilient to that rejection. And it requires utilizing every skill we cover on this podcast to build relationships that reduce defensive bias. And if you can do that, you can have a real effect on an individual. And we've seen that happen just throughout the course of relationship building with some of our pro-gun allies that are good media resources. And each of us can also do that. Like, we have the power to do that. It's just, do we have the drive and the, motivation to do it?
Yeah, I think there are still plenty of people in the media who want to be perceived as, the ones to bring the most interesting and, genuinely, or factual information. So if you can present yourself as a really useful and available expert, you're going to find somebody in the media who values that. Mm-hmm. So there will inevitably be some place where you can make a difference.
Yeah, the opportunities are there. Once we get further into this podcast, we're going to explore a little bit about what you can do with written communication and online communication to try to build some of those relationships. We haven't quite got there yet because we feel that the most effective way to make a difference is in person. But that said, you can also make a pretty big impact online as well. So it's something that we are getting to. We're not quite there yet. But once we get to that, some of it is going to be very useful for people who desire to talk to reporters.
Listener question number 3. Why do you think that anti-gun activists cling to the Australian solution when they often have no idea what happened here?
So this is basically referencing Australia's gun bans. Australia essentially banned semi-automatic firearms and instituted a massive buyback, like nationwide.
And it is commonly referenced as the something that we should do following a tragedy, because the narrative goes that Australia had some mass shooting event and then they instituted this massive gun control and elimination scheme, and wouldn't you know it, everything there's perfect subsequent to that.
And I'm going to just break in for a quick moment and just reference what we talked about earlier and say this is an example that we are not trying to reduce defensive bias in a person who agrees with a gun buyback. So the tone of our podcast is not for that person. So please don't share this with them thinking that this will convince them that a gun buyback is a bad idea. This is not for them. This is kind of talk amongst ourselves talk.
America number 1 is a populist position, but I get the feeling that a number of American intellectuals and creatives, I'm saying this, referencing people that I know and I've spent a lot of time around, have a little bit of an inferiority complex when it comes to comparing our traditions of creative and intellectual work to those of continental Europe. Now, Australia is not Europe, but I'm going to use Europe as just sort of a catch-all for the constellation of foreign solutions that people want to import to the United States, right? So Europe is envisioned as a place that's advanced and sophisticated, based largely on a few outlier examples of wealthy and homogenous Western European and Scandinavian countries. And it's not necessarily unique to the issue of guns, right? So any number of social programs are cherry-picked from these outlier examples, propped up as, brilliant successes, which should shame and embarrass us American primitives. And they're assumed to be easily transplantable to the U.S. And this whole meme of, but they do it like this in some other country, right, gives me the feeling that there are some number of class issues at play here, where aspirational urban or educated Americans are ashamed and guilty about their rural or working class peers and think that American is a synonym for the parochial stereotypes of those demographics. So European ideas stand in as saviors to elite Americans and give them a way to distance themselves from the people they disdain yet claim to help. So I think there's this enthusiasm for ideas that, quote, work in other countries, when our idea of work is based on a not very close example of what's actually happening there and a not very sophisticated analysis of what makes that place different. Demographically, if you look at countries that are most similar to us in terms of size or population or demographic makeup or economic distributions, the places that are the most similar to the United States have the most similar sets of problems, and the places that are the most different have different sets of problems that, things that might work there won't work here. And the places that are most similar to us struggle with the things that we struggle with too.
Yeah, I think my take on this is that simplicity wins over complexity every time. And so it's pretty easy to look at Europe or to look at Australia and say, look what they did, this worked, without considering any of the other complexities and without even really doing a deep enough dive to determine whether it actually worked. Well, it's kind of human nature that we tend to favor simple solutions. And getting somebody to appreciate the complexity of a topic is really difficult, especially when it's a topic they don't value or even a topic they actively dislike. People outside the gun world, for the most part, don't really understand the motivations and attitudes of gun culture, and they haven't really thought through the logistics of enforcing a ban or a buyback here. So this is where asking those how questions is really handy. And if you remember how questions, we talked a little bit about those in our Thanksgiving dinner episode and in some subsequent episodes. What how questions do is they encourage somebody to continue their line of thinking beyond the simplistic and to start to delve into the complex. So if you say, well, a gun buyback will never work because this, and this, that person's just going to tune you out. You're most likely going to activate that backfire effect, and they're going to become more committed and more determinedly anti-gun than they were before. Instead, if you start asking a series of questions, you can actually just encourage them to explore those thoughts themselves, and it reduces the backfire effect, and it kind of introduces the idea of complexity in a way that doesn't come from you, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
If that were me, the questions I would ask are, I would start with validating, of course, because we agree that fewer deaths, less harm, that's the goal. Everybody agrees on that. So I'd start by asking what outcome they're looking for specifically. Are they looking for fewer deaths? Are they looking for fewer injuries? How many? What's the target number of reduction? Because, we're never going to get to 0%. But what's a realistic target number of fewer deaths that we can try to achieve? And how would a buyback work to achieve that? What percentage of the population would have to comply before you would see results? What percentage of the population do you think complied with similar legislation in the past? For example, when New York instituted a requirement to to register assault weapons, what percentage of the population complied with that?
How many high-capacity magazines have been surrendered in New Jersey where they were banned?
The answer to that is 0. Instead of just trying to beat them over the head with that fact and say, nobody's going to comply with this because look what happened here. Instead, if you ask them to guess how many and then tell them the correct answer, it's a better way to kind of encourage that line of questioning rather than just shutting them down with, throwing facts. So you can say, how many people do you think complied with New York's registration requirements? Say, oh, well, I don't know, maybe 80%? Well, no, it's actually 5%. So this is our, American tradition of non-compliance, which I'm kind of proud of, actually.
Yeah.
So then, depending on what kind of answers they give, you can kind of play off those answers. But one place I would go is to ask them, could you be a little more specific about how you would get people to comply if they don't want to comply? How much would a buyback cost?
Or even if they're not, a policy or enforcement expert, right? Like, I can't fairly expect them to have some elaborate strategy for how to, generate compliance. You can ask them, would X be acceptable to you as a strategy to generate compliance, and sort of like walk them down, through various degrees of extremity in what's plausible for enforcing compliance, and ask them specific questions about that too.
Yeah, you could do that. You'd have to be really careful though. So anytime you ask a question with an answer that you provided, there's a chance that you're going to lead them into a trap. And so you're going to induce suspicion. So I think in general, like, you could do that very carefully, but in general, I think you're better off just asking an open-ended question and just asking them to expand on it. Because the point, again, is not to prove them wrong with facts. The point is just to help them to explore this topic a little deeper and to kind of get them to appreciate the complexity of it more. So it's, it's not really about any specific fact in particular. But another question I would ask is, how much would the buyback cost? And then maybe put in a personal story of my own and say, my assault weapon is a rifle I built myself, and it's probably worth about $2,000. And what's the incentive for me to sell it if the buyback price is less than that? Is there some incentive that motivates people to sell at a loss? And then depending on their answer to that, you can explore other questions. Like, if you make it a crime to keep a prohibited weapon, how would you catch people? And what impact would that have on the prison population? Who's most likely to be caught? And depending on your knowledge of that person and their values, you can kind of direct your answer towards what they find important. So, like, say, for example, if you have a traditionally liberal person, you can say, well, what impact would that have on the prison population? Because, the way it is now, there are racial disparities in enforcement of crimes at all levels. So how would you avoid that? Or, kind of just encourage them to think through it. And the goal is to kind of point out some discrepancies in values that start to emerge when you get deeper into the complexity of the topic.
Yeah, it's hard the places that have the will and the capacity to enforce these kinds of prohibitions are the places which are going to even accidentally generate racially disparate outcomes. Big cities lock up a ton of black people because of the drug war. The war on guns won't proceed differently from that.
Right.
We're going to have circumstances like that on the one hand, and then some number of, Ruby Ridge style events on the other hand. And it will have a human cost that I don't think anyone can bear.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, and when you start asking about enforcement too, you kind of ask, like, all right, if you write an unenforceable law, the only people that you can possibly enforce it against are the people who have contact with law enforcement already. And that's disproportionately Black and brown folks. So there are a lot of values issues here that you can kind of get into when you get into the complexity of the topic. But if you just throw those at a person immediately, they're going to just reject it. But once you kind of like build some good faith and you build a good discussion and you build this goodwill, now you can discuss these issues and come to some common ground on them.
Yeah, and you don't have to hit them with all of them. Like, don't fire hose them with questions.
Mm-hmm.
Each one of these questions has enough depth to it as to be revealing in itself of how complex the problem is. Like, each question is a fractal.
Yeah, and it's not a gotcha. So if you remember on the last episode, we played a quote about Second Amendment activism, which is, keep the big picture in mind.
Every time I'm faced with a decision, I close my eyes and see the same picture. Whenever I consider an action, I ask myself, will this action help to make this picture a reality? Pull it out of my mind and into the world. And I only act if the answer is yes.
So yeah, that's something we keep in mind with our Second Amendment activism as well. The point of this discussion is not to prove them wrong. And if you treat it that way, you're just going to induce the backfire effect. The point of the conversation is to get the person to explore and to get the person to have another conversation about this with you later, and to kind of build enough goodwill and enough good relationship skills that you can have a good and honest and open back and forth. So any question that leads to a gotcha is going to basically destroy all the goodwill that you've been working on building.
Yeah. They shouldn't feel trapped. They should feel like they are enjoying this process of discovery and that they want to learn more. It shouldn't be, getting your knuckles hit with the ruler every time you come to this conversation.
Right. Yeah. And as you question, the more you ask those how questions, eventually they get to a point where they kind of start to realize that they didn't understand the complexity of the topic. And that's the point where you validate and you solidify any agreement on any common ground you can find. And then you kind of start to discuss solutions that would work better and that maybe don't involve gun control, and that you can agree on values. And we'll start to cover a few of those. John has covered a few in the bad argument of the day. As far as examples go, like, for example, reducing crime in urban areas by cleaning up the landscape.
Right. And encounters with complexity are a great place to introduce common ground. Right. You acknowledge that you also believe it's complicated. Yes, I see that this is complicated too. It's complicated and it's intractable. This is the highest hanging fruit. This is the most uphill battle. And this is the point at which, even if we all agreed that these were, we have serious ideological differences even before we would implement any of these nearly impossible solutions. However, there's this entire body of great things we could be doing that we agree on ideologically, and there's almost no barrier to execution. Like, let's put all that other stuff aside and squeeze these things for the juice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, gun control really is the path of most resistance when it comes to reducing violence and crime and reducing the harm that comes from guns. And there's a lot of other things that we can agree on. So if we can focus on that, we all win.
Yeah, exactly. But this leads us to another topic, right? So what if you're actually doing well? What if you have created a positive encounter with complexity, like a revealing encounter with complexity? What if someone is coming to the realization that the things they thought were easy and obvious are in fact complex and impossible?
Yeah.
What do you do when you're doing well, when someone is starting to realize that their values don't overlap with their process?
That's a really core question. And we haven't really gone over this yet, so it's time. But when you're doing well, the best thing you can do is quit while you're ahead. And I know that's tough because as people who are significantly invested in the gun control debate, which a lot of pro-gun people are, you want to kind of keep up the momentum. And if they say, okay, well, maybe an assault weapons ban isn't the answer, don't continue to hammer them. And don't continue to drag the conversation into other areas that are equally challenging to their worldview. That's the best way to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've seen it over and over. I've actually done this myself several times, and I regret it. Now that I know a little better, I'm like, oh, I really should have just left this alone. But once you get to a point where you've made some progress towards common ground and common goals, the best thing you can do is leave it alone and just let that information percolate and give them the opportunity to think about it and maybe come back to you later.
Yeah, they will go out into the world, and with the new information and the slightly different outlook they have, they will encounter a number of things that they are used to hearing. They will be on the receiving end of all the messaging funnels that they've created through their, use of social media, through their peer group, and they will hear the things that they're used to hearing. And they will encounter those things with a slightly different viewpoint. And They will generate more questions. They'll come up with their own objections for these things now that they've been introduced to the complexity of it, and they'll find themselves not receiving these messages in the way that they're used to receiving them. And they'll come back with more questions, or they will ask some of these questions to their peers and potentially receive a negative response and increase the distance between them and that kind of messaging.
Yeah, it's almost like inoculation in a way. And this is a really good thing for them. And the other thing is, if you're doing these conversations right, where it's a true exchange of ideas as equals with respect for both positions, they're going to come away with some of those ideas, and so are you.
Yeah.
So you're going to encounter something about, how the libtards are, going to ruin America, and you're going to say, well, wait a minute, now I understand a little bit more of this complexity that I learned from my friend. And it serves to inoculate both sides and reduce partisanship on both sides.
Yeah, if you're honestly and genuinely engaged in the processes that we discuss here in this podcast, the interactions that you have with people are going to shape you as well.
And that's a good thing.
Over, the years of interacting with my friends on both sides of the political spectrum, I've kind of moved around within a range of ideas as the result of, if I respect this person and they make a good case for something, I'm going to reconsider it. And the more I examine what my values actually are, the more some of my policy positions move around. I used to be like very, very strong libertarian anarchist. And the more that I thought about certain things and what tools we had at our disposal and what kind of outcomes I wanted to see, I thought, there is a certain kind of, once you start looking at costs and effectiveness and quality of life outcomes, there are certain kinds of things where it's like, yeah, I can see how implementing certain kinds of social programs winds up having a lower social cost and requires less government intervention than things like enforcement and dealing with aftermath. So like, you move around, you kind of soften your position on certain things. And I think that's been the result of like genuine, honest interactions with people based on values.
Yeah, I think that's a very good thing for both sides. I think a lot of it's easy to be blind to it if you're kind of in an echo chamber of your own party where your solutions are the right ones and everyone else is wrong. But you know what? There are a lot of times when there's more complexity that can be expressed in a simple talking point. And so the better you understand your position, the better you understand their position, the less likely you are to villainize them and the less likely they are to villainize you. And so we can actually move forward on solving problems. It's kind of the opposite of the radicalization process that's happening now between the parties where nobody can talk to each other.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of our goal. All right, anything else you need to add?
I think that is it. That was we did almost a whole hour on dodging listener questions.
I don't think it's necessarily dodging them. It's just they were very good questions that led us to some insights that didn't always relate to the question.
Right.
But yeah, they got us thinking, which is the goal here. So, all right. Thank you, everybody, for submitting your questions.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening to this episode of Guns Guide to Liberals. We encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast on all of your favorite venues. Have a very Merry Christmas and we'll see you before New Year's. Maybe Happy New Year's too.
Happy Kwanzaa.
Happy Kwanzaa. Yeah, that's when the spirit of Marcus Garvey comes to your house and gives you a rifle.